Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of Cities of Tomorrow podcast channel. I'm your host, Hamed Tavakoli, and today we're going to talk about urban trees. Australian cities have never had more urban forest strategies, yet many neighborhoods keep getting hotter. Tree targets are missed, canopy inequality grows, and delivery remains painfully slow. Why? Today's guests believe the problem is not a lack of evidence, it is the way cities make decisions. Dr. Thami Croeser is a research fellow at RMIT's Center for Urban Research. His work sits at the intersection of urban planning, ecology, geospatial data, and institutional reform. Wow, already amazing. He was part of the team behind the Green Your Laneway program, which helped transform Melbourne's first 4 green laneways. In a study published in Nature Communications, he studied over 2.5 million buildings across 8 global cities and shown most of them are failing a basic test of access to nature. I'm already fascinated. I've got a lot of questions. Let's go through the conversation. Welcome, Thami, today to our podcast today. I'll start the first question. Most researchers find their subject. Yours seems to have found you, the other way around. You have described urban greening as something close to an obsession. Can you tell us more about your background, your research, your maybe childhood memory or something like that? Give us some background on that.
And firstly, thank you very much for the invitation, Ham. It's such a pleasure to be with you and your listeners. Um, I am very much an urban greening guy, and I remember exactly the moment where I knew that this was my fascination, and that must have now been about 15 years ago. I was at university. I'd gone back after being a practitioner for about 10 years to do my master's because I realized I was passionate and fascinated by cities. And I was sitting in a lecture about infrastructure. The person who was talking, her name was Dr. Dominique Hess, and I'm very grateful to her because she was the first person who gave me this idea that there's green infrastructure, that trees and nature and the green spaces around us in cities are very much part of the infrastructure that we need. And that afternoon, I walked home down a street with no trees on it, past just these urban environments which had a massive gap in the infrastructure delivery. There were perfectly functioning roads and curbs and drainage and public transport. Every piece of infrastructure you need, from police to health, it was there. It was planned very well and it was sitting together, and there was no nature. And I realized, my God, this is an enormous gap in how our cities have developed, and there's a really interesting career in closing that gap. And I've been into it since, from councils to strategic planning with the EU to doing a PhD, and gradually moving into all kinds of science, telling the story of how we can have more nature in our cities.
Where was that specific street? Can I ask you where was that you could have
Yeah,
seen?
totally. If you want to pull it up on Google Maps, it's in North Melbourne.
Yeah.
And it's the strip where you're going down Victoria Street, which it's a really wide street. It was quite a hot day, as I recall, and it's got a tram down the middle of it. It's got these big overhead wires, and it's just where Victoria Street kind of goes to Errol Street, which is the kind of main street of North Melbourne. And that street, I swear that street must be like 50, 60 degrees during a heat wave, but it was just a warm day, and it was barren enough that I really had a bit of a eureka moment.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Um, so obviously you completed your doctorate at RMIT focused on why cities fail to deliver urban greening at the scale their own strategies demand. After years of researching this, what was the most uncomfortable finding in your research?
I really, it's quite strange doing a whole PhD, generating an enormous amount of knowledge and working alongside lots of other people who generate knowledge, and then realizing that maybe it's not primarily a knowledge problem. I come across so many really intelligent, really committed people in fields like landscape architecture, horticulture, arboriculture, urban design. They know their stuff, and if they were in control, we would have cities that we had that green infrastructure that we need. Um, Our problems are a bit more structural and political in how we actually generate space, how we make cities happen. And quite a lot of that is about our collective priorities. We are very strongly in favor of cities that work for cars at the moment. Cars very much dominate our urban design in many, many ways. So if I do seem like someone who tries to put himself out into the world a little bit more, it's partly because I've realized knowledge is part of the challenge, and there are areas where we do need knowledge, and I generate some of that knowledge. But political momentum and a change in our public appetites for how we allocate our space is probably more important than that. And as someone who researches that, that's sometimes a little bit uncomfortable to face because I don't really want to be a politician, but we have to have a public discourse about this. And in some ways, the university position is a very enjoyable one because I am independent and free enough to be a public intellectual and push some of these uncomfortable ideas about how far behind our cities are, in the hope that that builds a little bit of political momentum towards reallocating space in our cities to more nature.
Do you reckon this is a political issue? Yeah, is that correct?
It's partly political. Yes, it is. It is a very delicate thing to change a city. Uh, you do see cities like Paris, where Anne Hidalgo and now her successor have succeeded in persuading the public and selling the idea, hey, we can have a lot more nature around us. And that has created a social license for them to do incredible projects like the School Streets project, where I think they've now got past 200 streets. If your child is going to school in central Paris, that street in front of their school is close to traffic, and those streets are now filling in with trees instead. That's the kind of change that happens when there is a bit of political vision and also a bit of public support. And I think that momentum is something that we build slowly through having this discussion again and again, doing podcasts like this, having media, social media, all that messaging slowly builds the momentum towards that moment where there is enough support for someone like Anne Hidalgo to actually change things up in a significant way.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thami, before the doctorate, you were a practitioner, and
Yes.
you've been engaged in some of the amazing projects in Melbourne, Green Your Laneway program that helped transform Melbourne first for Greenland. Can you talk about that program and what did you learn from that specific program?
Yeah. So shortly after I entered urban planning, I got a call from the city of Melbourne because they were interested in my work on vertical greening. And they said to me, we're looking at maybe a laneway program. Would you be interested in doing a little bit of analysis on that for us? And they brought me in, I think they gave me a 10-week contract initially. And I came in and I developed a protocol. I surveyed the city's laneways. And it was a really wonderful job in that brief period where I started to map out the potential of every laneway in the city. There's about 240 laneways in the central city.
Wow.
And some of them had spaces where we could probably close the street completely, where we didn't need traffic circulation. Some of them had really nice blank walls, which were very well suited to vertical greening. And some of them had things like areas where we could maybe catch stormwater. So there were all these interesting possibilities for tree planting, green space, pedestrian space, vertical greenery. And I produced these maps and they said, all right, we'd like you to kind of run this program now. And
Wow.
the critical turning point, which made it very exciting and a little bit stressful, was we put my maps out to the public and we said, here's the potential that we see in the city's laneways. And the ask to the public was, do you want one? If you live or work in the city of Melbourne, you can say, yes, please do this on my street. And some streets, some laneways gave us nothing. Some laneways weren't very interested. Other laneways, every single building owner and tenant said, yes, please make our
Yes.
laneway like this.
Wow.
So we expected to maybe get 30 or 40 responses on this public consultation that we did. We got over 800. So the director of city design at the time was Rob Adams. He's a real city shaping legend himself. He said, all right, let's do 4, which was a bit of a big moment for me. I think I was in my late 20s at that point. So I thought, oh shit, okay, now let's make this thing happen. But We did. We went out and I did the community, a lot of the face-to-face community engagement in those laneways, and I got to know almost everyone at each little door in those laneways. And it was a incredibly intimate engagement process. I got to know so much of those communities. And it was also fascinating because you realize uh, we assume that people are quite conservative. They don't want to change their streets and their public spaces too much. The whole time, they were pushing us to make things greener, to be more aggressive. So in many cases, it was them that said, let's close this space to cars. Let's take some space away from cars. The public appetite for change really blew me away. I mean, granted, these were the keenest of the keen. And in many cases, you had really beautiful structures of organizing amongst those neighbors. They often knew each other quite well. So maybe these were the outliers. But oh man, it was such a pleasure to work with a lot of those community groups. And when it was time to go in and say, okay, I'm going to plant a creeper that's going to cover your whole wall.
Wow.
And, that's considered a pretty conservative, that was considered a very challenging thing. And many of our internal people said, no one will ever agree to that. I came along, I worked with our council lawyers. We came up with the agreements for vertical greening. We went through some of the other processes for closing roads to traffic or extending curbs to make space for tree planting. The community had our back 100% on that stuff. It was really, really quite smooth in terms of community support. The surprise was actually that because we were doing something innovative, it was actually our internal structures inside council. City of Melbourne is very progressive. It's got really good people, but none of the processes existed for doing new stuff. So in many cases, it was actually sorting our internal stuff out. That was the really challenging task. Well, we got there. And if you now live in Melbourne, the two laneways that I think were most successful, Guildford Lane, which you might have seen on Instagram. It's apparently the
Yeah.
most Instagrammed laneway, maybe after Hardware Lane. Or the other one that's really beautiful is Myers Place. They both turned out stunningly well. Myers Place, we actually closed a significant section of it to traffic on a warm summer night. It fills up with people on chairs and tables, and there's a huge green wall on Loop Bar, which is still there. I think we finished this project in 2018, so it's been almost a decade. We put a lot of greenery in those lanes, and I learned a lot through the process.
Amazing. Did you have any public resistance amongst those, people, the residents?
You know what was most controversial, Hamed? And this is an interesting one. It totally surprised us. There was almost no public resistance to more greening. There was really strong license for that. Everyone backed us on that, from little restaurants to big corporate stakeholders who said things like, "Oh yeah, just use a section of our basement for a water tank." People were great on that side. The things that they fought about were art. So on a few walls, it was not feasible to do greening. Often that was because there wasn't a soil volume at the base of the wall, and you couldn't do a planter for some reason. Then we had these deliberative processes where we could do murals. So I just set aside like 10 grand in the budget. We paid some really excellent street artists. We had a selection panel. The shit fights between neighbors of what art they wanted to have were spectacular in some cases.
Wow.
Sometimes it was beautiful, everyone agreed. Other times those were the angry phone calls of all the things. Trees, creepers on walls, no worries.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing. Such great experience. Thank you for sharing that. Let's jump into your research. Many people have heard of 330-300 rule, but not everyone knows what does that mean. Could you explain the idea behind it, where it came from? Is there any scientific background on that? Can you explain a little bit more about this?
Absolutely, yeah. So for your listeners, 330-300 is a guideline or a benchmark which tells us how much nature you should have around the place that you live or work or go to school. So 3 is 3 trees within view. So you should be able to see 3 trees from your house. 30 is 30% canopy cover, so tree shade in your neighborhood. And 300 is 300 meters or less walk to a local park that's at least a hectare usually. So a decently sized little park. You should be really nice and close. And the reason that people came up with the 330-300 rule was it's a really nice, clear, and intuitive benchmark of how much nature is adequate. The person who came up with it was a guy called Cecil Konijnendijk. He's an academic and consultant and a real thought leader in urban forestry. He used to be a professor at the University of British Columbia. And the way he came up with this was he reviewed the evidence, particularly human health evidence, on nature in cities, because there's been a lot of really excellent research. Quite a lot of it's come out of Australia around how much healthier we are when we have nature around us. So he did this big review, produced a big synthesis, and he understood that views to nature are important for our health, particularly our psychological health. The canopy cover is really important for things like heat, but also there's lots of research now that things like cardiovascular health is better. People are more sociable. There's all these quite surprising effects of tree cover, and of course being able to get to a park so you can socialize, so you can walk your dog. All of those benefits are really, really well evidenced. Of course, there was a little bit of judgment required on producing something that essentially rhymes, 330, 300, and in every city it's going to be slightly different. Maybe our city needs 29% canopy to deal with heat, or 32%. This is a ballpark. This is what we call a heuristic, or a rule of thumb on how much is enough. So that's what I went out and measured around the world once I got interested in this metric.
Amazing. So your research published in Nature Communications applied this rule, 330, 300 rule, to more than 2.5 million buildings. Am I right? 2.5 million buildings?
Yeah.
How is that? Like, how did you measure 2.5 million houses? Can you explain about this research?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a journey for me, Hamed. I really come from a policy background and a project management and community engagement background, but increasingly I've been fascinated by the power of geospatial science. And when I say geospatial science, that's basically just working with maps. And the reason it interests me so much, and why it's become a significant part of my job, is that we are getting better and better and better at characterizing what's actually going on in our cities with things like satellite data, with aerial data. And now it's at the point where we can look at an entire city in one go. I can get the whole city of Amsterdam or the whole city of Seattle and look at it, and I can know where the trees are, where the buildings are, where the roads are, where the parks are. There's really, really good quality data for some cities around the world. It's getting better. And the other thing that I guess is moving forward so quickly is code. Like, we are able to now do a lot of this analysis in ways that's automated. So I used to sit with, software like QGIS, which is spatial software, and have to click through a whole bunch of processes to do it for, one or two buildings. Now we can do it for hundreds or thousands of buildings at a time. So when I conceived of this project, I went out and found these 8 big cities around the world, places like Singapore and New York and Seattle and Melbourne and Sydney. And all of these cities had really good data, including layers which show exactly where all their buildings are. So I was able to, I started thinking about the 330, 300 rule, and I went, okay, how do I calculate each of these tests? Does this building have a view to trees? Does this building have a bit of canopy around it? Does it have a walk to a park? And I figured out and coded up each of those tests. I'd written them myself, and then I found about 9 computers scattered over my campus that weren't being used. And I set the code up on them, and I was still learning. So we had to tweak the code and get things right, but these things sat and ran. Some of them ran, I think it was New York. One of these computers just ran for like a month, calculating, figuring things out, because it was inspecting every single building. It was running the tests. And at the end of it, I knew like every workplace, every home, every school in all of these big cities, I knew exactly how they did on the 330, 300 rule.
So you got 8 cities. You investigated 8 global cities. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
So and also you analyzed Melbourne also through this framework, 330, 300 framework. Yeah, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I had only Central Melbourne at the time of publishing. So I just had City of Melbourne at the beginning. I've subsequently looked at Greater Melbourne as well. But yeah, Melbourne and
Can
Sydney. Yeah.
can we expect like you publishing more information about the larger metropolitan Melbourne very soon, or are you working on that specific project?
I, I I'm working on a global project actually. So
Yeah, amazing.
I've now started to get my hands on data sets that cover the planet. So in coming probably in the next 12 months or so, I'm hoping to publish something that actually covers the full extent of every city over 50,000 people in the world. So Melbourne will definitely be in that. I what I found, Hamed, was interesting. The three is a test that most cities pass. So I think it's actually less interesting. I got really interested in the 30 because that's the test that almost everyone fails. So
100%, yeah.
I'm kind of doing a bit of a study on that canopy primarily, but that's forthcoming for sure.
Congratulations on this ambitious project that you're running through. That's amazing. I'm already looking forward to see what is the outcome. Can you name a number of good cities amongst those that you investigated and where Melbourne sits amongst those cities? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So I was not surprised when Singapore performed quite well. Singapore has a couple of real strengths. It's got a beautiful tropical climate, lush and excellent water, but it also has very, very strong urban governance, and it's a really uh, kind of urban country in itself. Like it's a so their city making is done very well. So Singapore is a place that works, including on nature. So Singapore performing quite well did not surprise me. You go to places like Singapore and walk around, there's greenery everywhere. It's well planned and well considered. The other one that did well that surprised me a little more was Seattle. And I got so fascinated with Seattle that I had to dig into it because it came second out of the eight cities.
Wow.
And what blew me away about Seattle was there's actually not as many trees in Seattle as in many other cities, but they're very big. So Seattle has big, healthy old trees. Now, I understand that Seattle is now dealing with I think it's a elm borer, emerald borer, perhaps. They're having a massive insect infestation in their trees, so maybe they're about to lose a lot of those beautiful trees. But Seattle's tree cover was really excellent. And looking at how Melbourne sits in amongst that, my study was pretty hard in its binary. It was just like you pass or you fail the 330-300 test. Melbourne failed on almost everything. We didn't do amazing. Even Sydney beat us by quite a long way. But I think the important thing that my test doesn't do is show how close you came to passing. So in some cities that you look at, like it's 5% canopy. And in parts of Melbourne, we've got that as well. But definitely in the central parts of Melbourne, it was more like 22, 23% canopy cover instead of 30. So yeah, we're falling short, but we're not dramatically falling short. So it might be that with the urban forestry teams that we've got here in Melbourne, we see that threshold starting to be met more and more often. But yeah, at the moment we're not leading the pack, but we might have a positive future there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going through another research of you. You've done a research on on-street parking in central Melbourne a while ago, and you suggested that almost half of those car parks, on-street car parks, can be removed or relocated to nearby garages. If that's the case, and you got the evidence, what is stopping us from doing that? Is that coming back to your first discussion about political aspects? Or why are we not doing that?
Yeah, so that was a really fun study. I did it in 2022, and the reason I did it was because I actually had, again, really good data. And I had this data which showed there's all these big commercial car parks and apartment car parks inside buildings that are only half full. So I was able to look at those locations and see all the on-street parking around them, hectares and hectares of on-street parking right next to buildings that could have those cars parked in them instead. So I showed that potential is there. I actually sent that to some City of Melbourne councillors. I sent it to some politicians. I sent it to some senior bureaucrats. And it was one of those real learning moments where I said, here's this amazing potential. And they said, cool, we love this idea. We'd love to see those places converted into green spaces. How do we do it? There was no, there was no, not even a concept of how to reallocate space at that scale. It's just not something that cities are used to doing. And, like we've talked about some of the examples of cities that maybe do it a little bit better, but local government is really, a lot of local government is about keeping things maintained and keeping things stable. And that stability is something that we value a lot, but it also means that there's a lot of inertia. It keeps things the way they are. So instead of the question when we sat down being, hey, this is a great potential, we love it, I've got an idea on how to do it, it was much more like, we have no idea how to do this. And I pitched some ideas. I think, for example, cities could actually set up parking garages inside private apartment complexes with very low utilization by renting those spaces off people. There's also private platforms where you can essentially rent out your own parking space. So maybe my apartment space is empty. I can rent it out to the public. Those systems are not too hard to engineer, but it was just like a completely unfamiliar possibility to people. And I was a little sad to see it didn't get much pickup as a result. But it was also a good lesson that just saying a potential is out there is part of the challenge. Another part of the challenge is having a sophisticated solution that leverages that potential. Maybe I'll come back to it in a few years.
Yeah, absolutely. You always talking about in your writings, in your research, you're talking about institutional reform as much as you talk about trees. Like, for example, and you earlier mentioned that Melbourne is not even close to ideal condition. What sort of institutional reforms? You also mentioned city councils. What sort of institutional reforms could happen inside the institutional institutions such as city council, government agencies for Melbourne specifically, so that we could see that urban forest growing and getting through that 40% target? What is the solution?
Well, any of your listeners who are landscape architects might share my frustration, and maybe you relate to this, Hamed. I think our institutions are still set up to treat landscape as decoration. It is a peripheral part of a much bigger, grayer city. So the serious business for a lot of councils and a lot of state government is putting in roads, putting in, new infrastructure, hospitals, schools, whatever it is. And the greenery is just something that kind of sits on the side, which means that you're really powerful people who get to make decisions on how land is used, often sit in infrastructure departments, like there's a city infrastructure department, and that will be a bunch of civil engineers. And I've had chats with those civil engineers. Some of them are fantastic. A lot of them don't see greening or green infrastructure as part of their job.
Mm.
And those people have the budgets of millions of dollars that we would actually need to deliver things. They will meet with the urban forest team or the landscape architecture team from time to time, but they are not necessarily interested in this as their core business. And I think bringing the people who really get shit done in cities, which I really think is primarily engineers, into this idea that, hey, we can do this together, but maybe it actually needs to be more of an engineer-led thing. That is one of the really core institutional changes that I think is powerful. And with that, the rules that engineers use need to change as well. So very often when I try to get a place to plant a tree in the city's laneways, and subsequently when I've worked with the EU, it's the same problem. You say, can we put a tree there? And they say, well, no, because there's a driveway within 5 meters, or oh, there's a gas pipe there, so can you just plant it somewhere else? They often have quite codified, powerful ways of saying no to nature in cities rather than problem solving and finding a way to have the tree and the gas pipe and the driveway. Now, what I know about engineers is they are excellent problem solvers. If they are given this problem and say, hey, this is your core business, deliver green infrastructure, they will do it. But the rules need to change, the roles need to change to get that stuff happening, both within councils, state government, perhaps even within consultancies that deliver a lot of this work as well.
So it's a collective issue amongst all those organizations, consultants. I would like to go through another aspects of cities, the equity dimension of urban greening. Um, so as you know, canopy cover, shade, cooling, and access to green space are not distributed equally in cities,
Mm.
especially cities like Melbourne. Wealthier suburbs have more trees, so they have the better environment. Hotter, lower income suburbs have less trees, and they can't have the capacity to get into 40%. How did you come to see this as central to your work? What do you think about this equity?
Yeah, I mean it's kicking people that are down already, man. It's really frustrating. And you got to the western suburbs where you have people who do not have a train station. They do not have an alternative to driving. They have these very long commutes, and their infrastructure isn't as good as in the central city. They face structural disadvantage, and often that's the only place that they can afford to live in the far north or in the far west of the city. And those places, some of these suburbs have 3 or 4% tree canopy cover because they were built partly on former farmland that was cleared. So there aren't a lot of trees that are formerly there. Sometimes they're actually former grassland ecosystems. So that trees are not the thing that necessarily grows there anyway. Getting the trees in the ground in those places needed to be done as part of the delivery of these places, and it often wasn't done, or was done inadequately. So uh, that's really tough when you realize that some of these people living in these areas cannot afford air conditioning. Or they don't have, like, if you look at some of these estates that are getting built at large scale now, they have black roofs on top of the buildings. They are packed really tightly together. Everyone's backyard is about the size of a parking space, and it's often got astroturf in it. So these people, they do not have nature around them while they're facing all this other kind of disadvantage as well. And then the heat exposure that they deal with is completely insane because their roofs are black and their streets are unshaded. So that it's deeply unjust that people who can least afford to handle any of the heat burden in cities often are the people who uh, end up in the hottest places.
Yeah, in new growth areas also, we can see it is really unlikely to meet the 40% canopy cover in newly established areas due to the lack of soil and structural soil and things like
Mhm.
that. So it seems a real question, a real problem, especially in west of Melbourne, as you mentioned. Let's go through one of your projects, 50 million euro EU project. Is it the same as the GIS you've done, or is it a separate project? Can you take us through that and tell us more about the nature-based solution that you propose in that project?
Totally, yeah. That was a really interesting project. It's also the project that got me into academia. When I was working for the city of Melbourne, I was starting to wrap up the laneway greening project. Things were looking like they were kind of getting built. And I went to a seminar where Professor Sarah Beckersey was talking, and she was talking about biodiversity. That's her thing. But at the end of it, she said, "By the way, I've got this really interesting project with the EU coming together. If anyone might be interested in working with me on that, let me know." So I just dropped her a little email, and within about 6 months, I was done with the city of Melbourne, and I was working on this $15 million, 15 million
Wow.
euro
Yeah.
EU project, which was across 7 countries. I think it was 8 countries. So we worked with the city in Italy, we worked with the city in Germany, we worked with the city of Liverpool, worked with the city in Turkey, Izmir, and a little city in Spain as well, Valladolid. And in each of these cities, the job was to plan out a systematic rollout of nature-based solutions. And if you haven't heard the term nature-based solutions, it's really very similar to urban greening. We were coming up with urban greening strategies for these cities. And the thing that made it especially exciting was Liverpool, Valladolid in Spain, and our friends in Izmir in Turkey. They actually got about 2 or 3 million euros each to demonstrate stuff. So while I was
Wow.
working with the whole team to get plans together for how they would address, their flood risk or their heat risk, whatever they were interested in, um, we were seeing all these demos being built over the 5-year project in these cities. And now you can go to Valladolid, which is just a short train out of Madrid, and walk down a street that has these incredible suspended hanging hydroponic like
Wow.
like oh gosh, it's almost like a green canopy, but of like cascading plants. And that was
Wow.
because one of the really most beautiful commercial streets that meanders through the old town is only like about 7 or 8 meters wide. So there wasn't really space for tree planting. They've closed it to traffic, but they occasionally need things like bin truck access, so you couldn't get trees. There was this amazing hydroponics specialist firm based in another part of Spain that joined the this huge consortium that we worked with, and they designed up this beautiful custom kind of green canopy thing. And all over these three cities, we saw magnificent stuff. Izmir ripped up a concrete canal that had been a river and returned it to a river status. And we went and saw that. So I think the EU's agenda in funding these kind of things is really bringing cities together, getting them to cooperate, but also showing each other and the world what is possible. So that was a huge privilege to be around, and pretty fascinating to see people trying to do the innovation that I battled with on the laneway stuff and seeing them run into the same painful struggles that I had, but then also see them come through it and deliver these incredible things. So it was a real pleasure. Unfortunately, it happened. I think I started that in 2018. So the real delivery time was, of course, when COVID hit. So I had
Wow.
these grand plans to go and spend lots of time in Europe and work with these guys, and I ended up sitting in Melbourne instead. But it was even from a distance, it was quite a pleasure to watch. And when we wrapped it
Amazing.
up in 2023, we had a lot to be proud of.
Amazing. Amazing. We've got a lot of experience. That's great. Um, Tommy, I want to ask you a question about Melbourne. We got a set target of 40% canopy cover in public land by 2040. Yeah. Is that even realistic? I can understand that generic canopy targets cannot be achievable. If we cannot meet these canopy targets, like for example, as we discussed earlier, in a posh, expensive area, people could have large area of land so they can have better opportunities for growing trees. But in growth areas, they possibly do not have that even 20% or 10% opportunity. I can guess, and I think you also think the same way. We're not meeting these targets. Uh, is it because the target is unrealistic, or is that because institutions are failing to deliver that?
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting question, and I get asked it quite often. Is 30% achievable even? And look, the truth about Melbourne is they've done really well. But when they announced their urban forest strategy, I think canopy across Melbourne in the public realm, which is what they focus on, was 21%, I think, and now it's up to 23. So it's good that they've
Yeah,
made progress, but 2014 was 11 years ago. And they were saying, all right, we need to get to 2040, but we need to get 40% cover by 2040. So it's now 2026. They've only got 14 more years and so far they've gone from 21 to 24.
yeah.
So if you look at that pace, unless we're on an exponential curve, which I really hope we are, and a lot of trees do grow exponentially, so maybe we're going to hit it still, but I'm a bit skeptical, and I've showed studies partly. I've produced work which looks at that a little bit, and it's partly because we're losing a lot of trees to development. So we're taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and sometimes 3 steps back when we knock down a big tree. So I I I I tend to agree with people that these targets are difficult to hit,
Yeah.
but I've always rejected the idea that they're unrealistic. I think that the target is not the problem. We know from the research very comprehensively we need 30% at least. Often it's 40 for heat. In particular, 40 is really more what we need. That is a biological, physiological thing. You can't say it's unrealistic to want clean air or to want, curbs that drain the water. This is a basic infrastructural need. It's more what's unrealistic at the moment is how we design our cities. I think our cities are very much designed in a way that is optimized to move vehicles around and also to maximize the yield on private sites. So you look at how apartments have gone up in Melbourne, all over the city, not just in the central city of Melbourne. 100% site coverage is very common. There is no little front setback area left, which you can have deep soil volume in to plant trees in. And there are abundant driveways which cross the street, which means you can't plant trees in those places. But so I think it's partly how we're doing development that's wrong. It's partly those engineering rules, which mean you can't plant trees near a whole bunch of stuff. But the flip side of it, Hamed, is that I see potential everywhere. I walk around our city streets and I see places that trees could be. And I think we have incredible urban foresters, particularly in the city of Melbourne. We've got a really, really strong team of people that are innovative and clever, but they're dealing with a budget of, I think it's a couple $1 million a year. And you're talking about changing a city profoundly. I calculated how much we need to get to that 40% target. I think it's over 180 hectares of new canopy cover. That's 90 MCGs. That is a massive, massive amount of change. That's going to need like infrastructure money. And we're kind of currently throwing landscaping money at it. So it's partly money, but I think the potentials are there. But we would need a much more aggressive program to accelerate to the point that we hit 40 by 40. That's
Absolutely.
my take.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you received a Research Impact Award for your work on the 330-300 rule, and the media campaign that followed reached more than 200 million people. How did that happen? This is already extraordinary reach. How did that happen, and what does it tell us about the role of researchers can play in public debate about tree planting?
Yeah, I was really blown away by that campaign, and I guess I took a couple takeaways from it. Firstly, I'm very gifted. Not like I'm very lucky, rather, to work in an area that is of such broad interest. You know, if I was a specialist in trams or I don't know how to design insulation, my work would be just as important as trees. But I don't think people would want to read articles about it. But when you tell people at a barbecue that you work with urban forests and trees, most of the time the reaction is really genuine interest. So
Yes.
it's partly just the content. I think nature is inherently fascinating to us. It's one of the reasons I do this. I think it's something we all feel a shortage of in our lives. But there are also tricks that I employed to get the story out there. So one of the things we did was we sat down with our media team here at RMIT. I was very lucky to work with someone who really knew the media landscape very well. So what we did was we made sure that we framed the story in an interesting way that people wanted to pick up. So I had a really good media release. I also had a pack of it, like maps and cool stuff. I even went to a landscape architecture firm. We went to Aspect, and we got them to do a visualization of Faraday Street, a street in Melbourne where there's huge potential for parking reallocation. And they did this stunning, quite realistic visualization of what we could have if we. Oh, hang on, no, that was a previous campaign. But anyway, I had lots of visual collateral in both campaigns, but make it pretty, make the story compelling. And then the last thing I did was I actually reached out to experts around the world in different time zones. Because what we did was we sent out a media release to Europe and we sent out a media release to the US. And in both of those time zones, I would have been asleep when the media was really active, right? So I went to a professor who was based in the Netherlands, and he in particular just did a heroic job. It must have taken up his whole freaking day, but he was on Dutch national news, and that kind of bounced around Europe a whole lot. This guy helped tell the story, and it happened to be Cecil Cananendek, the actual inventor of the 330-300 rule, went two places in the Netherlands, showed people the 330-300. They had their own visuals. It went to the US as well. And then in my time zone, it's partly that I've got relationships in the Australian media because they know that I produce interesting stuff sometimes. Having those mates, having the collateral, having the angle right, that all kind of came together really luckily. And I say luckily genuinely because I have had other times where I've tried to run a campaign and I've put all those pieces together and it's just been the wrong moment. And it didn't happen. Actually, the funny thing about this one with the 200 million people was we were going to shoot it out 2 or 3 weeks earlier, but then the US election was happening and Trump won, and there was absolutely no chance to get in the press for about 3 weeks. And when finally the press died off about Donald Trump, then I put my piece in and we managed to get some attention. So that was a very successful campaign. And I got so much follow-up as a result of it from policymakers and practitioners. So I was pretty proud of how it went.
Well done. Thank you. Um, um, Tommy, imagine you discussed about political issues, institutional issues that we have through tree planting in our streets. Imagine the Victorian Premier gives you complete authority over urban greening for 1 full year. What is the first policy or institutional reform that you introduce from tomorrow?
Yeah, well, we're yet to see which premier we'll have, but whoever's coming, here's my pitch. Uh, what what I think we should be doing, because we're a very heat exposed city and we have extremely poor protection from heat, especially in the places that we live and work. We need an infrastructure scale rollout of urban forestry in our cities to get canopy around the places we live and work, around the schools that our children go to, particularly along walking and cycling corridors, places that people catch public transport, places that people shop. And that is a $1 billion job. It is not like a job that councils do. Councils' budgets are often, in the tens or hundreds of millions for everything. We're talking about infrastructure. So this is something a bit like the level crossing removal project, about infrastructure across Melbourne in a very systematic, effective way. A lot of those places are actually really quite well done. Or metro, that's another thing that's really produced good infrastructure. We need a task force, an urban greening or urban forestry task force with money. It needs power, the power to say, I'm sorry about your driveway. We're doing the tree anyway. And that money and power and authority to get shit done at scale is what we need. So I would be saying we've just appointed a new task force, and I'd be probably taking the project managers, the engineers, the landscape architects from some of those other major infrastructure programs that have worked together well to assemble that task force to really make sure that we see a much better rollout. So you're seeing trees every 5 meters in streets rather than one every 30 meters, which is often the case at the moment.
Absolutely. I hope that the new Premier of Victoria hear this and they establish the task force for us.
Call me anytime.
Yeah. Um, Tommy, we've talked today about data, streets, institutions, equity, reform, a lot of things. But underneath of all of them, there is something more personal. What, why do trees matters to you personally? And what is your message to the public, to the practitioners who are working for government, engineers, and so on and so forth?
Okay, those are two different questions, and I'll start with the first one. So,
Yeah.
why is it personal? If you came to my house for dinner, you would very much see it, and it's been something that I've experienced for probably more than 10 years. I love living in an apartment in dense areas. I love city living. I love walking everywhere. In fact, I haven't owned a car for probably a decade. I really like the buzz that inner Melbourne has, and I like that lifestyle. And when I go to Europe, I see it being done really, really well. But I'm living my little Melbourne version of, I don't know, Paris or Barcelona over in Collingwood. But it's so grey in those areas. Often the places where apartments get built are post-industrial areas like Collingwood or Brunswick, and they do not have the legacy of tree planting that we see in some of the older suburbs. You go out to the inner east, places like Kew or Eaglemont, and like they have beautiful street trees. Some of those are the areas that actually do
Yeah.
pass the 330, 300 test, which is quite a stringent test. Those guys have it good. That is people in houses with four-wheel drives parked on their driveways. Those are not people living that kind of cosmopolitan urban lifestyle. The only people that really get decent access to nature are in the wealthy inner suburbs. The moment you want to live in the outer suburbs, you've got very little shot at nature, at least tree cover. And definitely in these inner city areas, like the one that I so really enjoy living in, the nature's all on my freaking balcony. Like it's the toughest plants that I can find because my balcony is really windswept and it faces north. So
Wow.
access to nature is a unpleasant choice for apartment dwellers who want to live a kind of really urban lifestyle in Australia. If you live in an area in Australia that's actually urban, not suburban, you kind of have to be pretty comfortable with walking down streets that are pretty treeless. And I hate that binary. I think we should be able to do both. You should be able to, if you want to, live an urban lifestyle and walk around. That's the personal take. Obviously, if you're someone who wants a big plot and to live at the very edge of the city, it's insane that you don't get trees there either. But for me personally, I want to be able to come out of the bottom of my apartment building and be under tree shade rather than just look at freaking loading zones. That's the personal angle for me. Maybe I'm motivated by rage, Hamed. Maybe that's what it is. I don't know.
That's amazing.
My message to practitioners is the scale of change that we have to achieve is staggering, and most of the practitioners that I meet are doing their damnedest already. They are driving really to get it done. Keep pushing uphill, but also please push for the systemic reforms that actually make our jobs easier. Because as long as we're pushing uphill and treating nature as this kind of peripheral thing that has the least rights, much fewer rights than an NBN cable or a down pipe on a wall, we're not going to get there. So let's work to change the systems we work within, and within ourselves, our attitude to nature as a kind of peripheral priority. Let's work on the systems while we also get the work done.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for such fascinating conversation. I personally learned a lot from your research, and I hope that we can have another conversation about your future research in our podcast series in the future. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks, Hamed.